thank you very much for the invitation to contribute to the handbook. I will speak about this topic. My plan is to, apart from Copenhagen and Niels Bohr and the Institute, I will dwell a little bit on Christian Bohr, Niels Bohr's father, as a role model for Niels Bohr. And I've been inspired by Stefano Osnagi's paper in the handbook, where he, at some point, he points to the fact that Niels Bohr switches from an ontological description of quantum physics to an epistemological description. And he says that he was able to do that must have had its origin in his peculiar philosophical background. So I will briefly touch upon that, Niels Bohr as a philosopher. Then, of course, there are aspects of Niels Bohr's interpretation of quantum physics. I think I will skip that so that we can have time for perhaps one question. And then, of course, Copenhagen was also important after Bohr died. Still, new interpretations of quantum mechanics, proponents of new ideas, would like to have the physicists in Copenhagen, their view on their new ideas. So I would end by briefly taking the point of view of Copenhagen in the quantum controversy in the 1960s, and I will take the example of Ove Petersen. Okay, so why was Copenhagen an important place in the interpretation of quantum physics? It's an unlikely event that Copenhagen became the leading center of quantum physics, really. So how could that happen? So we have to go back to World War I, where Denmark and the other Nordic countries were neutral. That meant at the end of the war, they sort of thought, it's payback time, we have benefited from this economically, so we should help restore European culture, including the sciences, after the war. In Denmark, a very favorable science policy was set up. The Rask Ørsted Foundation was meant to support Danish science within international science, and Bohr benefited a lot from that. It was important that Niels Bohr and Harald Bohr made sure that Copenhagen could become a very important venue in the interwar years, where also German scientists, notably in hindsight Heisenberg, could participate, because Germany was, of course, weakened after the war, and German scientists were excluded from the scientific community. So this became very important. Niels and Harald exploited this favorable science policy to focus on that. Then it's very important that in Copenhagen there was a favorable attitude towards the new quantum theory. So I call Bohr Mr. Quantum himself, because he was very open-minded. Well, he has just published the atomic model, and he was very open-minded towards radical change in physics. So we see that in many places. For example, in this letter to Maclaren in 1913, he writes, "We agree about the necessity of new assumptions. But do you think that such horrid assumptions that I have used necessary? For the moment, I'm inclined to most radical ideas, and I do consider the application of the mechanics as only of formal validity." So this is important because, for example, in Sweden, where you would also have a favorable science policy, the Swedish physicists were originally rather skeptical towards quantum physics, so that became important as well. Then, as I've come to learn during my research into that topic the last year, and so I can, I think, confirm what philosophers would say about Niels Bohr, that he was as much a philosopher as he was a physicist. And that, paired with his high status in the scientific community, of course, played a huge role. Then there is the Copenhagen interpretation, named after Copenhagen. And here I just suggest that this was the philosophical ideas that were fostered here by Bohr, Heisenberg, and Pauli, and by which all other interpretations were later measured, you could say. So, but mentioning Heisenberg and Pauli as well, this leads me to also mention that the visitors in Copenhagen really made it the place. This is a picture from the conference there in 1929. Bohr could attract, with this science policy that was available in Denmark, he could attract eminent physicists from all over the world that came to Copenhagen for shorter or longer periods. And Koshevnikov has pointed to The fact that they talked about what they were doing in Copenhagen as Knaben Physik, they were boys physics, because most of them were under 35 years. And Heisenberg has called this spirit that they experienced in Copenhagen. There was this collaborative spirit, informal attitude, atmosphere. They call it the Copenhagen spirit. So Bohr really facilitated this collaborative work, or he really proposed to do, well, he really was a proponent of free research when they could come to Copenhagen, and he would facilitate their stay and their travel and so on. The visitors were hugely important for making it the place. Of course, the frame of this collaborative environment was the Institute for Theoretical Physics that was finished in 1921. And of course, Bohr was very much influenced or inspired by Ernest Rutherford in how to build this institute. And he had just come back from England, where he had been a postdoc with Rutherford, and was inspired in how he ran his experimental laboratory there. But I want to suggest that Niels Bohr was also very much inspired by his father's institute, or where Niels Bohr grew up, because the way he built this institute, only half of the space was reserved for research facilities. The other half was for living quarters. So the Bohr family lived on the first floor. On the top floor, assistants could stay, and the technicians and so on. And I think that's a copy of how his father had arranged it, or how it was arranged when he grew up in his father's institute, because his father was a prominent professor of physiology, and he was the leader of the medical institute in this building, famous or prominent building in downtown Copenhagen. The family lived on the ground floor, 12-room flat, and then on the top floor lived the anatomical professor, and in between there were teaching facilities with the tall anatomical theater and so on. In the courtyard there was another building with a physiological laboratory where Christian Bohr did his research in physiology, where the assistants lived. And at this period they lived here from 1885 to 1911, when Christian Bohr died prematurely of a heart attack. This was crowded with students, and he had assistants, and in the evenings doctors that worked at the hospitals would come around for their research. So he was working round the clock, and there was a blurred division between family life and work. So I think Niels Bohr copied that in his institute. I want to dwell a little bit more with Christian Bohr as a role model. He established experimental physiology in Denmark. I think there are some striking parallels, so that Niels Bohr, as a kickstart to his career, he could have had his father as a role model, because Niels Bohr established modern physics in Denmark, particularly theoretical physics. Christian Bohr was very active in science policy. This was a period where in the end of the 19th century, the way it was very difficult to expand for a laboratory facility, but he was very successful in that regard. And one of his key values in his scientific engagement was free research. Bohr was an eminent fundraiser for theoretical physics at the Institute, and he facilitated free research for all the visitors that came to Copenhagen. And then there was the thing that Bohr copied the way the Institute was where he lived. As a child, the line between work and family life was blurred. At the end of the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century, he worked actively for internationalization and defied, there was a prevailing anti-German atmosphere in Denmark after Denmark lost the war to the Prussians in 1864, but he defied that. He went abroad to Germany and studied with the leading German physiologists, and made sure they could come to Copenhagen for an international conference. Harold Bohr and Niels Bohr worked actively for internationalization, particularly when we think about the interwar years, and made sure that German scientists that were otherwise excluded from the scientific community could come to Denmark. So, at least there are some striking parallels, and for me it makes a lot of sense that Niels Bohr, the eminent scientific leader, didn't just drop from the sky like the Danish flag, but that he could actually have had some role models there at home. Then I've been inspired by Stefano Osnagi's paper, because he says there is this peculiar philosophical background to Niels Bohr's philosophy that made him able to switch from an ontological interpretation to an epistemological interpretation. So Bohr was inclined, there are some evidence of that he philosophized very early on. He discussed philosophy of biology with his father. He was very interested in philosophy of mathematics when he started studying at university. And apparently around the time of his doctoral defense of free electrons in metals in 1911, he wanted to write a book about his philosophy. He didn't do that. Instead, he busied himself with physics. He went abroad and invented the atomic model. And then he only returned to the idea of writing a book about his philosophy 20 years after. This was the time after quantum mechanics was invented, and he had started to build his interpretation that was then published in the Thoughts in the Como lecture. Bohr had a philosophy, and he returned to that philosophy at the time when the physicists started interpreting quantum physics. And we can see that in many letters. For example, this one to his friend Carl Wilhelm Usen in Sweden, when his Como lecture was received, he wrote to his friends, similar to this. It's a general attitude which I've had at heart during all these years that I have been occupied with quantum theory. As we have already discussed years ago, so they met for the first time in 1911 in Copenhagen for a mathematical conference, and so Usen had known about Bohr's philosophical ideas then. I want to suggest that they accede to Niels Bohr's philosophy was these discussions he had with his father about the philosophy of biology around 1910 at least. So because Christian Bohr faced epistemological problems in biology, there were these two rival descriptions. Of course, he was an experimental physiologist, so his focus was to get as far as possible to explain the mechanisms or the processes in the organism by means of physics and chemical methods. But then there was a rival description, a teleological description, where when you look at a body, an organism, it seems as if these processes that goes on they have a purpose to sustain life of that organism. So the question was how to bridge these two rival descriptions. And Christian Bohr started mentioning this at the time when they began to discuss these things around 1910, just a year before he died. Niels Bohr returns to this after his Como lecture in this paper, for example, from 1993, Light and Life. He says, the role which teleological arguments play in biology reminds one of the endeavors formulated in the correspondence argument to take the quantum of action into account in a rational manner. So he likened, so to speak, the teleological description in biology with the new situation in quantum physics that comes about because of the quantum of action. The crux of the matter for Niels Bohr with the quantum physics was the discovery of the quantum of action. And he says this is what dictates the new situation in quantum physics, because it introduces what he called an indivisibility, a new indivisibility. Because you can no longer, if you have a measurement situation, you can no longer divide the situation into object and observer. So instead you have to look at it as a sort of whole, the observer and the object together you could actually say what Frank Lalo mentioned yesterday in an entangled situation, so to speak. And that's because, of course, of the smallness, you could say, of the quantum of action. You cannot ignore the interactions between the observer and the object. And therefore, there is this introduction of a new object-subject problematic. And you have to see Bohr's philosophy as a way to come to terms with this. How can we then have objectivity in quantum physics? So that it becomes clear that his interpretation is an epistemological interpretation. So it's indeed, he writes that to his old teacher and good friend, the philosopher Harold Höfting. It's indeed in particular the purely epistemological side of the analysis of concepts that I have preoccupied myself with in this work. This is the time. Okay, now I want to switch to the 1960s in Copenhagen and focus on Aage Petersen. So this is a picture of Niels Bohr and Margrethe Bohr and Aage Petersen, who accompanied Niels Bohr to the US in '57. Aage Petersen, sorry. I have learned that he is dead, but I don't know when. So he worked as one of the last assistants of Bohr from 52 to 62. After Bohr died, he went abroad and got a position in New York. And then he started working with Yakir Aharonov on non-local variables. At the same time, he wrote a dissertation about quantum physics and the philosophical tradition, which he sent to Copenhagen to have it evaluated in Copenhagen. His friend, the professor of philosophy, Johannes Witt-Hansen in Copenhagen, he writes home to him. The advent of quantum physics meant the end of ontological philosophy. So this is very much in line with Bohr's interpretation of quantum physics. Okay, so very soon he starts writing home to his philosophy friend. The last few months have been a lesson learned for me about how easily it is to turn dogmatic when things no longer grow. He has talked to Yakir Aharonov. I have often thought about what would Bohr have said to the new ideas. So of course this is always the case with proponents of new ideas. They wanted to know how Bohr thought about it. And the next best thing, if they couldn't get hold of Niels Bohr, they would ask somebody who knew him very well. So ironically, that could have been Aage Petersen himself. Anyway, so he continues after talking about the work he did with Yakir Aharonov on non-local variables, that so far I have not written to the physicists in Copenhagen, for it is a delicate matter to touch Bohr's fundamental ideas. So a lot of proponents of new ideas would have experienced that. Okay, so he sends this dissertation with the main thesis, which is very much in line with Bohr's thought, to the Copenhagen, and there's a physicist in the institute, Mogens Pihl, who is the head of the commission, and he writes an evaluation where he starts out saying, the author does not attempt or pretend to interpret quantum physics in a new way. You can almost feel, yes, very positive, very positive. He also sent his dissertation to Bohm, and apparently Bohm wrote 2 long letters with objections. He sticks to the ontological point of view, not surprisingly. Okay, so this defense attracted journalists. It was reported in the newspaper. So there was this drawing. Here we have Aage Petersen defending. Oh, yeah. Here we have Aage Bohr in the audience. Apparently Aage Bohr really regretted that Aage Petersen ran away to America. He would have wanted Aage Petersen for the institute, really. Here we have another assistant of Niels Bohr the last years, namely Jørgen Kalkar, who was ex-auditorio for the defense. Here we have 2 philosophers, Johannes Witt-Hansen, who was the other head of the commission, and Jørgen Jørgensen, who is on the left. Okay, so this is my last slide. So the journalists were attracted to this defense because they had really expected that the dissertation had summoned, in particular, the young atomic physicists for a fierce debate. With foreigners like Feyerabend and Bunge, the later years have shown attempts against the Copenhagen doctrine. And among some of the young atomic physicists, there is a certain desire to test the strength of what is considered to be dogmatics. That didn't happen. So Berlingske Tidende quoted some of the comments that were said during the defense. And Mogens Pihl started out by saying, when we in Copenhagen first heard about your dissertation, we hoped that now came the book proper about Niels Bohr's philosophy. And Jørgen Kjærgaard, who was ex-auditor, was critical of his review of the classical philosophical tradition. That was too brief, he said, but the work presents you as a worthy disciple of the great wizard. So they were probably relieved that he didn't write about his work with the Akira Harunov in this dissertation, and they were very favorable towards it. Yes, I think I will stop with that and see if anyone has some questions.